Friday, while listening to a podcast, I heard the expression, throwing off colonial yokes, referring to the necessary action that occurred prior to the US declaring independence from Great Britain. The sense that yoke characterizes an oppressive regime that unfairly limits freedom is only one interpretation of the word yoke. In today's readings, we've heard yoke referenced multiple times. We do ourselves a disservice if we limit our thinking to one definition of the word yoke. In our first reading, we heard there were 12 yoke of oxen ahead, and Elisha was with the 12th yoke. Then in our response, we heard, put your neck under her, wisdom's yoke. And in our gospel, take my yoke upon you, and learn from me. My yoke is easy. In an effort to better understand these references, let's look at yoke through three lenses. First Testament, Hebrew scriptures and wisdom literature, Matthew's community, and finally us in 2020. The word yoke comes from the verb meaning join or unite. A little known fact, the word yoga derives from a loose translation of a Sanskrit term meaning to yoke or unite. So what might yoke mean in the Hebrew scriptures and in wisdom literature? One definition of yoke is a pair of oxen. And in our first reading from Kings, 12 yoke of oxen translate as 24 animals working in pairs. Owning 12 yoke of oxen in those days, roughly 856 before the Common Era, was really an indication of great wealth. Elisha was the son of a wealthy landowner. He had a comfortable life. Picture him out plowing the fields with 11 laborers. When Elijah, en route to Damascus, threw his cloak over him, it was an invitation to Elisha to come and follow as a disciple, to give up his family and his wealth, to be Elijah's successor. Then in our response today from Sirach, which is sometimes referred to as Ecclesiasticus, written probably 2 centuries before Jesus' birth. Classified as wisdom literature, God is presented here using female imagery, guiding the people as they journey across the Red Sea, through the desert, meeting them in their daily lives and offering hope. In Greek, wisdom, referred to as Sophia, curious. It's curious to me that this is the way that God was named a couple of 100 years before Jesus was born. Put your neck under wisdom's yoke. That evokes the definition of yoke as a large piece of wood, which sometimes connects 2 oxen to each other to plow or to tow something. And yet wisdom's yoke evokes or suggests care. So context of how the word yoke is used does matter. A pair of oxen, a piece of wood. Let's now look at how yoke is used, what it's meant to Matthew's community. We know that each of the synoptic gospel writers interpreted who Jesus was in light of the prevailing culture, and they built on the writings of those who came before them. We're using what supported the position and where what was written before didn't, creating content that did to fill the perceived voids. We know that Matthew was a scribe, very well versed in the Torah and the Jewish tradition. And in rabbinic tradition, Torah and service to God are called, guess what? A yoke. Jesus creatively delivered his message using language people could relate to, often with a deeper impact, in a way that really resonated with his followers. Rather than deliberately speaking to the unjust economic system that Torah law imposed on the rabbis and the resultant exploitative, unending labor of the Jewish people, Jesus chose to expand the meaning of yoke beyond what restricts to what frees. Imagine the vulnerable, the marginalized, the burdened, hearing Jesus say, "Take my yoke and learn from me. My yoke is easy." I suspect this was a welcome departure from the black and white rules of law. Instead of demanding compliance, Jesus yoked himself to his followers, present and active, joined in a shared relationship, giving them a vision of work that ceases to oppress and even invites liberation. And Jesus's message is, this is available without qualification to everyone. That must have been pretty unusual then. Actually, it's still pretty unusual now. In saying, "Come," Jesus expressed urgency. It is time to take action. Leave your old ways of doing things and live like me. So let's take a moment to look at the economy of yoke. When I was in school, I hated word problems. So I'm going to throw one at you. If a trained ox can pull 5,000 pounds and an untrained ox 2,000, yoked together they can pull how much? 5,000, 2,000. 7,000. But rather than 7,000, the answer is actually 10,000. This was different math than I learned. Over time, however, the untrained ox becomes trained, and the two walk in step. And then they can pull not 10,000, but 15,000 pounds. That, my friends, is exponential impact. When I was in grad school, the first course I took was on the prophets. And one of the texts was Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. One point he made that I think is relevant today. And it's funny, I don't usually remember things from courses, and it had been a long time since I had been in an academic class, returning in my probably mid-50s. So one point that Brueggemann made was that Jesus articulated a future distinctly different from an unbearable present. And that was energizing only to those for whom the present had become unbearable. Believers of that future were able then to sing and to dance, to heal and forgive. That stayed with me, and I think it's as relevant today. So in 2020, how might we think of being yoked? Perhaps from multiple dimensions. We've yet to confront and break the yoke of systemic racism and sexism that oppresses brown and black bodies, all those who identify as LGBTQ, and women throughout our world. We've got to look at ourselves and identify what we attach ourselves to. People, places, beliefs, and ways of being in the world. And ask whether they energize us or diminish our power and our freedom. And we need to realize that the realities that we navigate daily are disorienting. Our lives and plans are disrupted.
Those numbers again, what? P700?
Many people feel weighed down by fear, financial insecurity, loneliness, and grief. Uncertainty pervades. Come to me. It's an open invitation to move from a solitary effort to a common effort, to acknowledge that God is within all and each of us. Working in tandem, we can move to the fullness of life that is promised. A yoke makes independence impossible. When yoked, you can't go your own way. Today, let's embrace interdependence, join together, and move toward exponential impact. Rest, singing and dancing, healing, and forgiving. And I want to close this morning with 3 sentences from Jan Phillips's blog. The future ahead of us is the future we create each day in our workplaces, our families, our encounters with strangers and friends. Our real work is to imagine the life we want and draw it toward us. We get there by re-examining everything we've been taught and dismissing whatever divides us from one another. Amen.